Good morning and welcome back to the online lecture series for English honor students organized by Department of English, KKM College Jamui and YouTube channel English Literature Briefs. Today I am very glad to say that I have been joined by my colleague and friend Mr. Ranjan Tiwari for his talk, and Mr. Ranjan is an alumnus of St. Xavier's College, Ranchi. He also holds a master degree in human resource management and a diploma in translation. Formerly posted with the Ministry of Defense, Government of India in the Department of Official Language, is currently posted at the Department of English, Koshi College, Khagaria. His area of interest in the 19th century literature and contemporary literary criticism. I welcome Priyanjan for his talk, and today he will be talking on the topic significance of nature in Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. So, welcome Priyanjan. Over to you.
Good morning, everyone. I would like to extend my thanks to the Department of English, KKM College, Jamui, and the English Literature Briefs for inviting me for a talk today in one of the sessions of their ongoing online lecture series for degree students. Uh, in today's this session, I'll be talking on the significance of nature as presented and portrayed in Ernest Miller Hemingway's famous novella, The Old Man and the Sea, which won him the Pulitzer Prize and was also cited at the award of Nobel Prize in 1954. Before we begin, I would say that nature has two implications in this novel, and it has a huge and major role to play. Hemingway's famous novel, The Old Man and the Sea, narrates the story of Santiago, a poor fisherman who lives somewhere in the tropic sea near Havana. For 84 days, he had not caught a fish, and his apprentice, a boy called Manolin, who sailed with him, also changed his to another boat, leaving the old man all alone and uh, unlucky. The old, aging, and experienced fisherman that Santiago is configured into a battle with a large marlin, and this is the core of the novel. He is seen as a sallow. Sallow is the worst form of unluckiness. Hemingway himself coined a term, the iceberg theory of writing, of which this old man and the sea is a nice proponent. Hemingway also worked for a large part of his career as a journalist, and in journalism, he believed that the deeper meaning of a story should not be evident on the surface, but should shine through implicitly. And that is exactly what he does in The Old Man and the Sea. The Old Man and the Sea, I termed this at the opening remarks as a novella because, as compared to a conventional novel, in length and in space, it falls short of a conventional novel. Therefore, we have this somewhat newer term novella being used for it. The story of the novel or the plot is very simple, and it's not at the same time as simple as it is because it's a prominent proponent of the iceberg theory. The novel examines man's place in the world while exploring his need for survival. One of the most prevalent themes in the novel is man versus nature, which is a theme that is symbolically puts humanity against the supposedly subjugated natural world. True to this, Santiago faces several challenges from nature, the most obvious being his battle with the giant Marlin, which lasts for almost 4 days. In this lecture, we will have a attempt to look forward at the significance of nature as presented in this novel. Nature plays a huge part in the novel since the setting is the sea and the fish is Santiago's counterpart. So two things: the sea, which is definitely which provides the setting, is one of the proponents of nature, and the counterpart is a fish, In this lecture, the significance of nature as it is presented in the novel will be analyzed. There are two possible ways to look at nature in The Old Man and the Sea. It can be seen as itself when we just look at how it is described and how Santiago's relation to this nature, his environment, the animals surrounded that surround him, etc., is taken that looks like. On the other side, nature can be interpreted as a symbol. While talking about the nature in The Old Man and the Sea, it is quite obvious to first of all have a look how this nature is presented in the novel. The environment of the fisherman, Santiago seems to be at first sight something completely ordered and in perfect harmony. In Santiago's world, everything is in its place. There's the sea with its creature in it, the birds, the sun, the moon, the stars, etc. The relationship between the animals in Santiago is more like friendship. We can see that, for example, on page 45 of the novel, there is a little bird that comes around to Santiago's skiff. And Santiago, though he is there on a hunting spree, is not hostile towards that bird. A small bird that comes to his skiff from the north, he was a warbler and flying very low over the water. The old man could see that he was very tired. The bird made the stern of the boat and rested there. Then he flew around, and the oarsman hid and rested on the line where he was more comfortable. And here we see that Santiago is in a sort of a conversation with that bird. He says, "How old are you?" The old man asked the bird, "Is this your first trip?" The bird looked at him when he spoke. It looks like the old man feels pity for the little bird. He talks to him like if he really could understand the language that the old man was speaking. This shows that the animals, especially the fish, like we see later in the novel, are like fellow sufferers to Santiago. In his world, every element is somehow united in harmony or love almost. He feels for the bird like he feels for any other creature he meets on his way during the time on the sea. He calls the flying fish his principal friends on the ocean. This is within quotes. And he is sorry for the turtles that are killed by other freedmen from the boats. He had no mysticism about the turtles, although he had gone in turtle boats for many years. He was sorry for them all, even the great trunk backs that were as long as the skiff and weighed a ton. Most people are heartless about turtles because a turtle's heart will best beat for hours after he has been cut up and butchered. But the old man thought, I had such a heart too, and my feet and hands are like theirs. This is an ample proof that he is very much in harmony with the nature around him. Here one clearly sees that the old man is not like most people who have no feelings for animals and think of them to be minor or less worthy than human beings. We get an impression that Santiago really is nothing more or less than one of the creatures in the sea. It can be seen that every element, including Santiago, is combined in a unity. In this context, it is interesting to see that Santiago wonders what the sea looks like from inside an aeroplane. One really gets the impression here that he is like the fish in the sea that are not able to view the sea from such a distance. The old man and the sea are in that moment like one thing that cannot be designated. We can also say that the old man totally depends on the nature because it provides his livelihood. From this point of view, nature can be called a living donor. There is, of course, not only this positive image of nature, it can be destructive and hostile as well. Certainly, it's not always a pleasure rowing on the ocean in search of fish. The nature that seems to be so peaceful at the first sight is also sometimes like an enemy. When we just look at the first page of The Old Man and the Sea, we see that nature brings misfortune. Santiago fished alone in a skiff in the Gulf Stream and he had gone 84 days without taking a fish. That is how these are the sentences that we found at the beginning of the novel. It becomes clear that man, even though he is a part of nature, is sometimes totally inferior to the world of nature. Because of his experience, we can assume that Santiago is a bad fisherman. Being unlucky just shows us that you can never rely on your skills when you are in the nature, because we are also told that he is probably the best in business. Yet he could not find a single catch for 84 days, which definitely establishes the superiority of the world of nature over all human experiences and activities. The cruelty that goes along with the nature from time to time is shown when the old man's outer appearance is described. His whole body shows signs of the destructiveness of nature. The sun assailed his skin, leaving brown blotches of benevolent skin cancer on him. His deep creased scars from handling heavy fish on the coast somehow witnessed the long struggle. Santiago had with nature, of course, there are also the sharks that take away the oarsman catch in the end. It looks like nature takes away what it gives. The sharks too are a part of this unity. Here they represent the destructive force of nature. Destruction and creation are closely connected to each other and are both a part of this nature. This shows a clear ambiguity here, however. Every element of this nature is united in harmony, but at the same time, there is this fight among the creatures themselves. We see this also in Santiago's compassion for the fish. The whole situation is ambivalent because the old man's feelings are conflicting. We already found out that he is sorry for the bird or the turtles, but his feelings for the marlin are different. They seem to be bigger. The fish is unlike the little bird, a total match for Santiago. It is extremely big and powerful, so that the old man has a 3 day long struggle with it. The fish is actually larger than the boat. After having swallowed the bait, the marlin begins to tow the skin towards the northwest, which is in the Gulf above Havana against the current. Both the old man and the fish now try to hold out. The marlin as he tows the skiff, the old man as he holds the fish with his line. His hands even start to bleed. The fish and the man are now connected through the line. They just have to wait that one of the two loses strength. And here is where we find that it is kind of a battle between two equals. The fish and the man are now connected in a battle, and they have to wait for the turn when one of them falls weak and leaves the strength. Both probably have the same thought. They must endure until the other one gives up. This thought can be seen clearly where Santiago thinks, quote, keep your head clear and know how to suffer like a man or a fish, he thought. This makes the two of them very equal. Here again, the reader gets the impression that Santiago is just like any other creature in the nature, or even thinks of the fish as a human being. Then he was sorry for the great fish that had nothing to eat, and his determination to kill him never relaxed in his sorrow for him. How many people will he feed? He thought. But are they worthy to eat him? No, of course not. There is no one worthy of eating him from the manner of his behavior and his great dignity. I do not understand these things, he thought, but it is good that we do not have to try to kill the sun or the moon or the stars. It is enough to live on the sea and kill our true brothers. In this passage of the book, one thing becomes very evident and clear, that not only the fish and the men are equal in Santiago's eyes, but also all other elements that are united in nature. Even the stars are termed as his brothers. It is like everything has a fixed role to play in this natural community. Santiago's role is to overwhelm the marlin. The marlin's role is to escape the old man. The bird that has to catch the fish to survive, but he has no chance because the flying fish are too big for him and they get to the catch too fast. It's the principle of a tussle between hunting and being hunted. The small one is always inferior to the bigger one. Santiago later experiences this principle when the stronger creatures, the sharks, attack and take away his catch. There's a critic who wrote, a sense of brotherhood and love in a world in which everyone is killing or being killed binds together the creatures of nature, establishes between them a unity and an emotion which transcends the destructive pattern in which they are caught. All contestants in the novel are related to survival. They are all in search of food. So it's not that they are killing each other for their sport. It is more a struggle for survival. Another aspect of nature, as it is described in this novel, is its changelessness. The boats go out to the sea, the sun rises, it rises always, and sets and rises again without change of rhythm. The fishermen catch their fish, they row back to the land, and the sun sets. It's like a routine that is repeated endlessly. Changelessness is also what describes Santiago's life the best way. Fishing is probably the only thing he ever learned and the only thing he has done his whole life long. It can be assumed that the old man starts fishing again as soon as he recovers from the strains on the sea. And since the ocean is unchanged for centuries, this changelessness is represented in the sea itself. In this context, it is interesting to see how Santiago's behavior as a part of this nature, or in this nature, looks like. We already saw that there is a unity between each element, and in this unity, there is a sense of brotherhood, a sense of coexistence. But how is the old man actually presented as an element in this unity? Is the question we always keep in mind, and we will have to answer, we have to find answers to that. We can see that Santiago gained a lot of experience during his lifelong sojourn on the sea. In the dark, the old man could feel the morning coming. And as he rowed, he heard the trembling sound as flying fish left the water and the hissing that their stiff, set wings made as they soared away in the darkness. So well is he versed with the sea creatures, the life on the sea, that he can almost sense everything beforehand. Here we learn that he knows the sea very well. Even at night in absolute darkness, he knows which animals surrounds him. Feeling the morning is coming certainly tells us that Santiago is really close with the world of nature around him. As a result of that, he is able to read the signs of nature. The birds, for example, give him a hint where exactly fish can be found. Now the old man looked up and saw the bird was circling again. He's found the fish, he said aloud. The fish are actually a good help. They can be called his guides. As he watched, the bird dipped again, slanting his wings for the dive and then swinging them wildly and ineffectually as he followed the flying fish. The old man could see the light bulge in the water that the big dolphin raised as they followed the escaping fish. Also, we see that the stars are of great help, especially to find the way. This the text goes like quotes, once he stood up and urinated over the side of the skiff and looked at the stars and checked his course. Even in the darkness, he does not feel lost. He is not alone in the hostile element, but does not show any sign of fear. He can rely, he can have faith, he can trust the world of nature that way. A lot of analysts and critics have looked at the old man in the sea in terms of symbolism also. I think especially the Christian symbolism is evident. If you just take the scene where Santiago returns to the sack, you come across such symbols related to Christ. Some Christian symbols can be found in the description of nature as well. Since the topic of this essay or this lecture and talk is the significance of nature, I'll try to point out some of the symbolic features of nature as it is presented in the novel. It is obvious to first of all have a look at the sea. It is most important element in the novel. You just have to see that the title of the book is The Old Man and the Sea and not The Old Man and the Fish or anything like that. This is pretty interesting. Why did Hemingway choose that title for the novel? Since the story is all about a 3 day long struggle with a Marlin, the title is not that evident. So then the sea must be very important component to the novel. First of all, we must say that sea is the biggest thing both in type and in area that we have on earth. Because of this range of the sea, Because this sea presents a sort of a stage or a platform where this entire activity is enacted or this entire activity is carried out, the sea is presented as a home. But the sea is also something which is always frightening, unfathomable, and mysterious equally. Consequently, the sea is in fiction often used as a symbol of life. A journey on the sea is like a symbolic journey through life. The participants experience life with all the accompanying things, just like Santiago experiences life with the sea. The ocean in The Old Man and the Sea certainly symbolizes life itself and the role the individuals play in life. But most of the boats were silent except for the deep of the oars. They spread apart and they were part of the mouth of the harbor, and each one headed for the part of the ocean where he hoped to find fish. The old man knew he was going for out, and he left the smell of the land behind and rowed out into the ocean morning smell one of the days. This is how the text reads. The boats on the sea represent here the people in real life. There are two kinds of people: those who have an active part in the life, and there are others who are merely observers of it and are very passive. Some boats are silent and paddle in the sea within this area where they know to be safe. They don't test their boundaries. Boats represent journey and often adventures or explorations as well. Those who don't go out far can't explore life thoroughly and gain less experience. Here, this reminds of Robert Frost's poem, The Road Less Traveled. Those who are not taking the road which is less traveled will not have novel experiences in life. This is exactly what this uh, sojourn on the sea is also reflecting to. Those who are not going to push beyond their boundaries will not have experiences which will be newer, which will be different to other the common folklore had. Santiago seems to have no fear, however, in going across his boundaries. He is not like the other boats, other people that stay within the surrounding they know the best. We find this idea of challenge in the textbook when we have an excerpt like this. Keep warm, old man, the boy said. Remember, we are in September, the month when the great fish come. The old man said, anyone can be a fisherman in May. Fishing in May does not mean much to him, but September is the month he likes to be at the sea. This time he is able to challenge himself with the great amount of fish and the power of greater fishes like the one he catches in the form of the great marlin. People who don't dare anything can't lose anything. The old man dares a lot and he loses a lot. That is why he's often categorized as a salau. Even though he cannot be called a loser because he gains more strength and knowledge than other fishermen, each day he is challenging himself. Santiago is able to read the signs of nature only because of his lifelong experience on the sea. This is very true. The amount of the time that you spend with the world of nature around you, the more are you able in comprehending, in understanding, in feeling the world of nature, the experiences of the world of nature. That is exactly what Santiago does. Because of his experience, his fearlessness, and his long life in fishing and sea, he probably knows each and every nuances of the life on sea. This shows that there are unexpected occurrences in life. Those who live their life to the fullest, like Santiago, will be the least affected by these storms because they have the strength and experience to handle them. The people on the land will be destroyed. They don't have the power to handle the destruction the storms cause. This fact tells us that those who know the sea well are superior to those on the land who can't read the signs of nature in the sky. It is possible that the birds also symbolize certain people who could represent the weak and less experienced people who easily get lost on their journey through their lives. Why did they make birds so delicate and fine as those sea swallows when the ocean can be so cruel? Getting lost here means being swallowed by the ocean. In real life, it would also symbolize death or failure of a person. Santiago is strong and skilled, we are told. Life can't be any harm to him anymore. But certain people, for example, the children with few experience, can be destroyed more easily. The stars can be interpreted as Santiago's guides through life. Once he stood up and urinated, that is what we quoted earlier also, when he said that in the middle of the night he can sense what is going to happen next. The sea is besides that also considered as the mother of life. The ocean is the beginning of life on earth. Life originates from the sea. The fishermen in their boats profit by it and supply the people ashore with the fish that is provided by the ocean, which serves for food and for livelihood to so many people and families. Therefore, both the ship and the sea symbolize fertility. In Santiago's world, the sea is considered to be a mother that supplies for the sustenance of life. And this is, how we have nature's predominance in the textbook, in the novel, as a dominant feature, and that is how we establish that nature is a significant part of Hemingway's Old Man and the Sea. Apart from that, Hemingway uses nature, the natural world around us, in other words, to describe Santiago's physical appearance, thereby forming a strong connection between the setting and the protagonist. Hemingway writes, quotes, "Everything about him was old except his eyes, and they were the same color as the sea and were cheerful and undefeated." So it's very evident, very clear here that he is forming a very strong connection between Santiago, the protagonist's physical appearance, as well as the world of nature, that is the sea. Even though the man's physical appearance is described as withered, his eyes are related to the brilliance of the sea, which signifies that he still has the mental stamina needed to survive his 84-day fishing drought. It seems that Hemingway sets up the plot through the connection made between the old fisherman, and the sea. And that way, the brilliance in his eyes is also a reflection of the indomitable spirit and perseverance that Hemingway's character in Santiago is overladen with. From the start of the novel, we learn that Santiago is isolated from his community. He's basically a hermit. In one aspect, he has been isolated because the community around him considers him unlucky because he has not got a fish. In another light, he is also isolated himself in the community on a more intimate level. He himself does not want to interact with so many people, except for that boy Manolin. We find that there is no other people with whom he is very readily agreed to meet, to greet, or to discuss and celebrate anything as is. He has created a cocoon of his own. He wants to stay alone, and therefore we say that he has isolated himself on a personal, on a more individual level also, so that he's not completely phased out. We see that Santiago's isolation allows him to form an intimate relationship with the natural world, which can help you visualize the sea and land in rich and descriptive way. So, more than studying the people around him, he keeps studying the world of nature. He keeps looking and interacting with the world of nature. Santiago sees nature as many others have seen it, and understands it probably better than the way others would have understood. And that is what we find in much of his interactions with the young boy Manolin. Hemingway writes, he saw the phosphorescence of the Gulf weed in the water as he rowed over the part of the ocean that the fishermen called the Great Wall. Well, because there was a sudden deep of 700 fathoms where all sorts of fish congregated because of the swirl the current made against the steep walls of the floor of the ocean. Here, there are concentrations of shrimps and bait fish, and sometimes schools of squid in the deepest holes, and those rose close to the surface at night, where all the wandering fish fed on them. So, Santiago knows the natural world so well, not only because he is a seasoned fisherman, but because he's dedicated his attention the ways to the sea. He knows it better than anything else. While his isolation allows him to be closer to the natural world, his decision to be so close to the world of nature isolates him from the community as well. And that is where we find that instead of choosing human beings, he chooses the world of nature around that. Now, when you talk of the significance of nature in Hemingway's novel, The Old Man and the Sea, you have to also keep this in mind that most of the activity we see is already there on the surface of the sea, that is the nature itself. The character Seven, you see, during his discussion with the young boy Manolin, Santiago refers to two things. One is the golden lions on the African shores, and then he often refers to the American baseball player DiMaggio, who was also one of his favorites. And we see that deliberately Ernest Hemingway presents in this novel everything that is the best in its field. Like Santiago is the best in fishing, similarly, DiMaggio is the best in baseball. And both of them can be categorized into a similar cell because of the perseverance, the indefatigable spirit that they reflect, and their will to fight till the end, their will to fight till the time they have this determination to exist and to live in consonance with the world of nature. However, nowhere in the novel we see that there is a hostility between them. What I have already told you, if there is any hostility as such, it is merely because it's a hostility that arises out of two beings fighting for each other's survival. So it's not that any of the creatures in the novel are killing each other for mere sport or for some time pass. It is not for that. They kill each other because they have to survive. They have to eat. They have to get something out of each other. So that way, we find that nature is very strongly and dominantly present. It's a very significant part and attribute of this novel. Uh, and I also feel that it's not very easy to, pour into all the aspects and facets of the presentation of the world of nature as well as human nature in this novel in one lecture. But then I have tried to present it somehow in a holistic way, and I'll request the students who go through the course of this lecture that please read the novel, and when you read this novel, also read two other things. One is the rhyme of the ancient mariner, more so because the mariner there is also equal to Santiago in his misfortune, and yet he also has the same level of perseverance that we have in Santiago. And Santiago's story is also very much, this is out of the topic actually, but for the level of understanding, I will be telling you, his story is very much similar to the story of the man named Dashrath Manji, uh, who's the mountain man. He's often termed as the mountain man because like Santiago or like Dashrath Manji, Santiago also has they know that it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but 84 days that they have to go without anything. And it will take out everything out of a normal human being until and unless you are blessed with the highest level of perseverance that Santiago has. And that's where we feel that Hemingway has created a character which can mm, definitely be taken as a role model in at least in the modern times where we have to face so many things, where we are shattered by a slight of misfortune. Uh, so these are things to be kept in mind when you read this novel. And however, unfortunately, Hemingway himself died committing suicide, which definitely is in no match to the correct character he himself created. So that is how I'll be summing up this entire lecture on the significance of nature in Hemingway's The Old Man and the Sea. Uh, I will look if we have some questions. We can have some questions.
Uh, thank you so much, Ranjan. It was an excellent talk. You have actually intricately dissected the from all possible points, from the perspectives of, say, character analysis, in terms of religious symbolism, in terms of eco-critical angle, in terms of philosophy of Hemingway. And you have quoted many quotations from the novel, many important quotations from the novel. It was indeed a very nice experience listening you, and I am very sure that the talk will be extremely helpful to the students, especially BA second year students of English honors, as it is prescribed in their syllabus. So I have few questions with me, which I have received. So let me put those questions on your screen.
There are two pair of foils in the story, Santiago and Manolin and Santiago and Marlin. What is Hemingway's objective by highlighting similarities, differences of two sets of characters? Now, you see, these two sets, Santiago and Manolin and Santiago and Marlin. Uh, Santiago and Manolin are very much on the same side because they don't have hostility among themselves, but they are not equals. That is also to be kept in mind. Whereas on the other hand, when you have this Santiago and Marlin thing, we find both of them are hostile to each other, but they are hostile because of their equality. Both of them are powerful, they are strong, their strength and their expertise is at tussle with each other. Now, when we look at the objective of highlighting similarities and differences, it makes the study a bit easier also, because we always, it's a human nature to love binary opposites. We need to have a struggle between two equally powerful individuals or objects or creatures, and that is what is being helped by creating these similarities and these differences. Whereas the similarity between Manolin and Santiago is the one that both of them are very understanding to each other. Manolin, despite the fact that he's of a very young age, is he seems to be full of the milk of human blood in him. He understands the pain and agony the old man is suffering in, and he somehow is a soothing shelter for Santiago, who gives him the strength from where he musters the courage enough to go and fight the Marlin, which he does in the end of the novel. I hope that has sufficed. Everything about him was old except his eyes, and they were the same color as the sea and were cheerful and undefeated. Kindly explain the line. Now, you see, he Hemingway says it's such a nice analogy between the sea and the old man. We don't know the timing, the time till when the sea is existing. So what he's saying is everything about him was old except his eyes, and they were the same as the color of the sea. Now the brilliance of the color of the sea is equal, and the glow, the determination to go and fight is reflected, and his old age is reflected in the time till when that sea is existing. So that makes pretty easier for us that uh, as we see, the sign of the sea never fades. Similarly, the glow in his eyes, the glint that is there, his hope, his aspirations, his determination that he will find one day the prized catch he's looking for, is very well reflected in the brilliant blue brilliance of the sea water. How does the theme of human relationship with reference to Santiago and Manolin and their interdependence on each other justified in the novel? This, see, the theme of human relationship is definitely justified, and Santiago and Manolin's characters and the intimacy, the understanding, the bonding between those two characters is created itself to show this human dependence, or the strength of this human relationship. They are interdependent on each other in the sense that the young boy finds a lot of interesting stories. He finds a sort of a mentor in the old seaman, this old fisherman, whereas Santiago in Manolin finds the youthly vigor, that determination, that urge to learn newer things, to carry on and go on and do something, repeatedly, in spite of the fact that he fails so many times. And at his age, it is quite unbecoming at his age for a normal human being to keep trying and trying and trying. So we feel that that vigor, that youthful energy, he drives from Manolin, and Manolin drives that experiential mentorship, that guidance, that companionship from the old man. And this companionship is actually both ways. Both of them are each other's companions. And therefore, this theme of human relationship is very nicely justified and gloriously presented in their relationships. Can Santiago be analyzed as a symbolic representation of Hemingway? See, if you go through the biography of Hemingway, as I ended my lecture on that reference, definitely he can be taken as the symbolic representation of Hemingway. But Hemingway's end of the way Hemingway ends his life is not the one which can be associated to Santiago, because the character of Santiago gives you this message that irrespective of all the odds, all the problems, all the misfortunes that come our way, we need to be determined. We should be have that perseverance level to go and crack the hat again. Whereas, whatever be the issues, Hemingway ended up committing suicide. So uh, they are symbolically the same, just the end is different. Otherwise, the rest of things, the way Santiago goes on discussing about the baseball players, the African shows, the lions and all, is very much similar to what Hemingway did in his lifetime when he had has a varied career as a journalist, as a short story writer, and as a novelist. So apart from the this end of their life, I mean end, Santiago ends up emerging out to be a man who I cannot term him as a victorious fellow, but then he also doesn't lose. He his lost his failure has brought so many positives with it. Whereas Hemingway ends up committing suicide, which is actually cannot be taken as example for anyone. So apart from that, rest all is fine. They can be analyzed as symbol. Santiago can be analyzed as a symbolic representation of Hemingway. Can we say skeleton of the face has a symbolic meaning? If yes, then how? It has a symbolic meaning. Now, see, just imagine if the old man would have returned back to the shore without even the skeleton. Now, just imagine what would have happened. The novel would have ended up on a note of failure for the old man. We could not have made heroes out of him. That carcass, that skeleton is a proof enough, ample enough proof that he actually had a great catch. He that removes the taboo of that slough thing, that unluckiness from his head. Now his fellow fishermen can at least see that yes, this old man found a really huge fish, hunted it, fought with it, but somehow it was eaten away by the sharks. So that way, this the skeleton of the fish is highly symbolical, and this skeleton, if it was not brought, the ended would not have ended. The novel would not have ended upon a positive note, and we would probably not have talked of Santiago in heroic on the terms about him in heroic proportions. We talk of him as hero only because, in spite of those 3 days struggle, he is at least bringing that skeleton as a symbol of his victory, that symbol of his courage and determination. That yes, I was in a fight with my equal, and this is what I have achieved. Do you think the old man's seclusion, interdependence, primitivism, and endurance are dissected in the novel? Huh, yes, they're very nicely dissected. This seclusion, independence. Uh, he actually, we don't see that he was having this independence. There was any bar to his independence. But as far as this seclusion and endurance is concerned, we see it through the course of the novel that it goes on adding proportions to it.
Right. Yeah. It was really interesting question answer session, I must say. And you have analyzed and the way you have answered the questions, that was simply brilliant. Thank you so much, Priya, for accepting our invitation and for telling.
Thank you, Dada.
Uh, Now, with your permission, may I move to the next speaker? Uh,
Yeah,
yeah,
of course. Thank you once
thank
again.
you. Yeah, thank you. Okay. So now let me invite the next speaker of the talk. She's a very good friend of mine, and she's a very erudite speaker, you must say. So let us invite Miss R. Kavitha. Kavitha, can you hear us? Kavitha. So let me introduce her first. Miss R. Kavitha has completed her post-graduation in English literature from Pondicherry University, and she is currently pursuing her PhD in urban studies in IIT Madras. She is also an assistant professor in the Department of English in Stella Maris College, Chennai. Her areas of interest include culture studies, urban studies, and travel writing. So I request Kavitha to switch on her. Yes, welcome to the show, Kavitha. And
Hi.
uh, yeah, and today she will talk on the topic William Wordsworth, the poet of the common man. So over to you, Kavitha.
Okay, hope I'm audible and clear. Is it clear?
Yes, yes, you are clearly audible and visible.
Okay. Good morning, everybody. I'm Kavitha, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of English in Stella Maris College, Chennai. So the topic that I would be talking about today would be Wordsworth as a poet of the common man. So, I mean, I'll be generally tracing the tenets of Romanticism and then going on to Wordsworth, and we'll be studying Wordsworth's preface to the lyrical ballads. So, when we look at Wordsworth as such, we place him within the age of Romanticism. Now, even when you are looking at the age of Romanticism, it is really necessary that you go further backwards and look at where this idea of Romanticism exactly started from as such. Now, if you look at the period from the 1660s the period when Rousseau began to write, Rousseau was considered to be one of the pioneers of Romanticism. So, if you look at the period from 1660 to the period when Rousseau began to write, that period, from 1660 till the 1780s, 1790s, till the end of maybe the French Revolution. So you had the French Revolution from 1789 to 99. So that period of time, it was actually fraught with a lot of wars of religion. You had civil wars in France, England, and Germany. So this was a point of time. I'm talking to you about the period that precedes Romanticism as such. So this was a point of time when people, were really scared. There was a lot of chaos, confusion. There was anarchy all around, and people were very, very hesitant to express their opinions. Everything was according to logic and reason. There was bloodshed everywhere, and the people were very, very prudent. Prudent meaning they were very, very cautious. They didn't know how to express their, or they didn't have a space to express their opinions freely. So this is the precursor of romanticism that we are talking about. So at this point of time, because there were a lot of wars and there was a lot of confusion all around in England, France, and Germany because of the civil wars and the religious wars, there was a restraint in everything. There was a restraint in terms of passion. There was a restraint in terms of education, and people were really, really scared to express their opinions. So slowly, all this cautiousness and all these confusions with regard to wars, people were getting quite tired of this kind of a scenario. And this was also the time when you had the French Revolution, as I told you. So from 1660, we are talking about French Revolution in 1789. So French Revolution, like most of you would know, French Revolution, the entire idea was to overthrow the monarchy. That people didn't want a single person to be in authority or a single person to be in power. So at that point of time, if you see, we had this idea of the divine rights of the king. Right? So the king was somebody who was the all powerful at that point of time. So the people in France, England, and Germany, they didn't want this kind of an authoritarian, position to be given to one single person. So this was the time when they had the French Revolution, because they wanted to abolish what you call as monarchy. And the French Revolution ends in 10 years later. So you're talking about it starting in 1789. It ends in around 1799 with the dictatorship of Napoleon. Now, this is an irony as such, because you didn't want a single person to be in power. But when Napoleon comes to power, again you have this sort of dictatorship, and again you have one single man having the power. So we are talking about 1660, and now we've come to 1799. That is towards the end of the 18th century, where you have Napoleon taking up this position of dictatorship. So once Napoleon comes to power, around the world, in UK, in France, in Germany, there is a sense of calm because all the wars are over. What people call as tranquility. Yeah, tranquility. It is a sense of calmness. So there was a sense of calmness everywhere, and people were getting bored with it. So we are slowly moving towards the time period 1815. So this is a point of time where people were really getting bored with all this calmness, because in the previous century there were, there was a lot of wars, there was a lot of confusion. Now people were getting bored with the fact that once Napoleon came into power, there were no more wars and people were quite free. And but at this point of time, they wanted some kind of excitement. At this point of time, maybe you're talking about the early 1800s, 1810 or 1812, 1815. During this point of time, so this is a point of time when people wanted excitement in their life, when people wanted to live their life to the fullest. They did not want to be cautious anymore. They did not want to be prudent anymore. So this is where you talk about, this is where romanticism begins. Romanticism begins at the point of time where people wanted to live their life. They did not want any kind of restrictions. They did not want to be cautious. So if you look at, the age of romanticism, the French use the word la sensibilité. Yeah? La sensibilité means sensibility. Now, the sensibility, the word sensibility here means that, you're talking about emotions here. What kind of emotions are you talking about here when you're talking about romanticism? Emotions here means that, a spontaneous or violent kind of emotions, which comes not after an afterthought. Yeah? It is very, very spontaneous. So even if you look at Wordsworth later, Wordsworth says poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. So this is where he actually gets his idea from. So at this point of time, you're talking about sensibility, where you're talking about spontaneous overflow of emotions, and the emotions must be direct, it must be violent. Here, you're not talking about logic and reason. When you're talking about the age of romanticism, you're moving away completely from the tenets of logic and reason. And here, if you look at the age of romanticism, another important aspect is that you're moving away from convention. What do you mean by convention? Convention is tradition. When you stick to tradition, or when you stick to the norms and rules and regulations of the society, that is when you talk about as convention. But here, Wordsworth doesn't, he doesn't stick to the conventions as such. He wants to break free from the norms of the society. And another important thing when you're talking about the age of romanticism is that um, they wanted individual freedom. Yeah, during the period of romanticism, the romantics, they wanted individual freedom that was not at all present in the previous age. When you're talking about the age when Rousseau was writing, or the period of the civil wars, before the age of romanticism, they didn't have individual freedom. But the romantics, they aimed at something that is passionate. They aimed at something that is they wanted something that is individual. They did not want to live for the society, but they wanted to live for their individual rights. This is one of the most important reasons why the romanticists did not like the word industrialization in itself. Because if you look at industrialization, it projects quietly an urban form of life, whereas romanticism, moves towards something that is more rural, something that is more aesthetic. So the romantics, they didn't like, industrialization as such. They thought it was all big and ugly, and it took away the individual rights of the people. And one of the most important aspects of romanticism that is very close to, when we deal with Wordsworth as well, is that the romantics focused on what you call as the aesthetics. Now, what do you mean by aesthetics? Aesthetics means, they focused on something that is, in the sense, beautiful. Yeah, something that is beautiful. That is what aesthetics really means. If you're looking at the period before Wordsworth, they concentrated on what you call as utilitarianism. Utilitarianism means utility. Utility means, the word, the meaning of the word utility. Utility means purpose. So they wanted purpose in everything. But with the advent of romanticism, it was no more about purpose. It was all about beauty, aesthetics, and all those things. That is why, if you look at the age of romanticism, the beginning of romanticism, you have a poet like Blake, Blake, who writes about the tiger. When we think of the tiger, what comes to our mind is something that is fierce. Something that might eat up human beings. So it's a very gory picture that comes to our mind when we're talking about the tiger. But when Wordsworth thinks about the tiger, he portrays it in a very, very beautiful manner. He says, "Tiger, tiger, burning bright, what immortal hand or eye could frame thy fearful symmetry?" So what he talks about here is that he talks about the fact that he says that God has created such a beautiful thing as a tiger, and the tiger has a powerful symmetry, meaning that a tiger looks equal in all parts, and it looks very, very beautiful. So, whereas we would associate a tiger with something that is fierce, something that is, maybe something that is powerful. Here you have William Blake, who is looking at the tiger as something that is beautiful, something that is aesthetic. The tiger is not something that is useful here, but it is beautiful. And another important aspect of romanticism would be, when you move away from Blake and Wordsworth, you have poets like Coleridge. Yeah, if you look at Coleridge, is also one of the romantic poets, and the way he writes is completely different from the way Wordsworth writes. Wordsworth talks about man. Wordsworth talks about nature. Wordsworth talks a lot about emotions. But if you move on to a romantic poet like Coleridge, Coleridge was said to have written a lot of his poems under the influence of opium. You also have the poem Kubla Khan, where Coleridge is supposed to have been under the influence of opium, and he sleeps and he dreams. And when he wakes up from the dream, he writes a poem about the palace of Kubla Khan that he has visualized in his dream. And you also have Coleridge's poem, The Rime of the Ancient Mariner, that has a certain Gothic elements associated with it, the presence of ghosts and all that. So, this sort of Gothic elements, the presence of ghosts, all these are also another aspect of romantic literature as such. So now I talked to you about Wordsworth and the kind of poetry that he writes. We talked about Coleridge. So we realized that, even within the space of romanticism as such, not all poets who write during that period write in the same way. So if Wordsworth talks about more about man, nature, and the people around him and the emotions. Coleridge talks more about imaginary, fancy, about ghosts and all. Dream, melancholy. All those things are what Coleridge identifies himself with when he writes the poems. And much later, after Coleridge and Wordsworth, you also have a poet called as Byron. Byron is also a romantic poet, but the way he writes is completely different. Byron writes poems in a violently passionate manner. His life, the kind of way he has lived his life, also influences the way Byron writes. Many of the critics talk about how Byron had been spurned by his lover, and he couldn't get married to the woman he wanted to. He couldn't get the love from the woman he wanted to. So when he wrote about love, or when he wrote about women, it did have a sort of negative connotation to it. So he wrote poems that were violent, that were even violently passionate. So from all these things, we can understand that when you're talking about romanticism as such, they move completely away from the traditional aspects that were talked about earlier. They wanted to, the romantic poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Byron, Shelley, Keats, all these people wanted to move away completely from the norms of convention as such. Um, Now I go on to, our main topic. We are talking about Wordsworth as a poet of the common man. Now, Wordsworth has written a lot of, his poems, his writings. They talk about a lot of things, as I told you. He talks about nature. He talks about emotions. He talks about, the growing up stages of his life. That was also, he has written it as a poem, how he grew up and the different stages of his life. Prelude, written by Wordsworth, talks about how, the different stages of his life, his development, and at different points of his life, what did he experience. So that is what Wordsworth's Prelude is all about. So he's written about a lot of things. Now, where did he talk about poet as, uh, as, uh, as being associated with the common man as such? Because earlier, if you see, the poet was always kept in an elevated position. Right? He was not associated with the common man as such. He was completely kept in an elevated position. He was at a position which was unreachable, and a poet usually used to talk about lofty thoughts, feelings, which a common man couldn't understand. But when you look at Wordsworth, he talks about the fact that poetry should be understood by everybody, and a poet should be writing in the language of man, because you are writing the poem for the common man. So a poem should be written in the language of the man that can be understood by everyone around him, the common people, or even the rustics, the peasants, the common man. Everyone should understand the kind of poetry that we write. So he postulates these ideas in the preface to the lyrical ballads. So that is what we'll be discussing briefly now to just get us an idea about what kind of poetry Wordsworth wrote and how did he want a poet to be. Yeah, the kind of um, uh, person that he wanted a poet to be. All these things he describes in detail in his preface to the lyrical ballads. If you look at the preface to Lyrical Ballads, it was actually published in 1798. First, it was published as an advertisement or an introduction. Advertisement means first time when it was published. It's basically Lyrical Ballads. It's a collection of poems by Wordsworth. So he writes a preface to it, or he writes an introduction to the collection of the poems or lyrical ballads that he has written, so that the readers can understand what to expect from this collection of poetry. So in 1798, as I told you earlier, 1799 is when the French Revolution ends. So he's actually writing the lyrical ballads during the French Revolution. So that is supposed to be the beginning, beginning of Romanticism as such. So in 1798, he writes the advertisement or introduction to the lyrical ballads, and later in 1800s, he revises it as a preface to the lyrical ballads. You have an 1802 version as well, 1802 version as well, where again, he adds certain elements. So as and when, we know that, each and every book, it keeps on getting published. So once the books get sold, the number of books that has been printed gets sold, the books are reprinted and they are republished again. So like this, whenever the collection of lyrical ballads written by Wordsworth was published, the preface that he wrote kept on changing. So he kept on adding things according to the age and time in which it was published. So as late as 1850s, also there were changes in the preface as and when the book was published. So now we look at briefly about the preface to the lyrical ballads as such. I'll just talk to you about the main points. From the lyrical ballads, and also how does Wordsworth associate the poet with the common man, or how does he think that the poet should write in the language that a common man can associate himself with. So that is why we have the title Wordsworth as the poet of the common man. Now, when he writes the lyrical ballads, Wordsworth says that it is essential that you need to choose incidents and situations from common life. So, for him, when you're writing a poem, it should not be some lofty thoughts, should not be some lofty ideas. You choose incidents from common life. You choose incidents from everything that is happening around you. For example, if Wordsworth sees, you have Wordsworth's poem as well, Daffodils. He says a host of golden daffodils singing and dancing in the breeze. So that's what he says. So that is something that is very common. He just passes by, he sees the daffodils there, and then he talks about, he makes that into a poem. That is something that is very, very associated with our personal life as such. You see something, it's not something that is associated with lofty ideas. It's not something that is associated with emotions. It's something that you see every day. So he passes by a field of daffodils and he writes a poem out of it. So for Wordsworth, in the preface to the lyrical ballads, he says that the lyrical ballads is all about poetry that is associated with incidents and situations from common life. And he also feels that it is necessary that in his lyrical ballads, he says he has written poems in the language of men. He hasn't used very, very lofty language. He has used a selection of language which can be easily understood by the common man as such. Now, why does he choose incidents from common situation? Is that, see, when you're talking about the nature around you, or when you're talking about incidents that are close to your heart, that is more honest, that is more close to reality. Yeah, it is that at that point of time that you are more self-aware also as a poet. So that is why he says that choosing incidents from common life helps us to be a better poet. And when you're talking about something that is happening around you, you also try to put it forth in a more simpler manner, in a more understanding manner, in a manner that people around you can understand. So that can only happen if you are talking about something that is close to your heart. So if you're talking about lofty things, you're talking about imagination, fancy, or if you're talking about, the society, logic, reason, all those things, the language cannot be very simple. It won't be something that is closer to reality. So when you're talking about common situations, incidents in your life, when you're talking about things that is happening around you, it is more simpler for you to understand as well as the people around you to understand, and the kind of language that you use will also be more flexible because it's more closer to reality and it's more honest, and it's something that is happening in your life as well. So when he talks about the daffodils, it is what he sees. He looks at the daffodils and says, a host of golden daffodils singing and dancing in the breeze. So that is what he perceives with his own eyes. So what he perceives is what he writes. So, lines like singing and dancing in the breeze are quite simple. You're just writing it in the language of the common man. And one more important thing that Wordsworth talks about here is that, as like most of the romantics during that point of time, Wordsworth was not interested in urban life. So all his poems in the lyrical ballads were associated with the rural life, were associated with the countryside, were associated with the peasants. He associated a lot of his poems with the countryside or with the peasants because he felt that rural life, or what he calls it, rustic. Rustic means something that is simple, something that is associated with rural life. So that is why he uses the word rustic in the preface to the lyrical ballad. So he says that when you are associating yourself with the rural life, with the countryside, with the peasants, the poetry that you create will also use a more plainer and simpler language. Because if you're going to talk about a shepherd who is grazing, who is grazing with his sheep in the fields, and it is, the poem is from the perspective of the shepherd. The shepherd does not speak lofty language. Yeah, he's gracing his shepherd. He's quite a simple man. He's a person who belongs to the countryside. So the kind of language that he speaks would be very, very simple. And he also believes that such kind of people, people who live in the countryside, people who are rustics, the peasants especially, who belong to the lower strata of the society, he believes that they are able to communicate in a more simpler manner, and they are more closer to nature. Yeah, rather than the people in the urban, urban realm. They live in the cities, they travel by public transport, and all they do is they are within the buildings and they do not see the nature outside. But when you're talking about countryside, people live what you call as being at one with nature. Yeah? So when they are one with nature, they're more closer to nature. And Wordsworth also feels that, he uses the word, they're far away from social vanity. See, you're not vain, you're not proud, you're not constantly trying to make yourself better. Yeah, you're not constantly running behind something like how people in the cities do. They live a simple life and they do not have much expectations in life. So these are the kind of things. Yeah, so themes with regard to the uh, rural space, themes with regard to the countryside, and most of his characters would be peasants, or young girls who come from the countryside and they want to work in the cities. So it'll all be people who belong to the lower sections of the society that he uses in his poems as such. See, when he talks about language like this, language that these kind of people use, he also believes that, since these people are more closer to nature, the kind of feelings that comes up when, as a poet, you are writing about a peasant, or as a poet, you are writing about the countryside, you are associating yourself more with experience. So any kind of poetry that is born out of experience, that's what the Wordsworth says. Any kind of poetry that is born out of experience, that is born out of regular feelings, is much, much better than using lofty language. Now, Wordsworth here also quotes the late neoclassical poets. He says that the late neoclassical poets like Dryden, Pope, all these people who wrote before Wordsworth, um, they wrote more about logic, they wrote more about reason, they wrote more about being associated with the urban space of life. But here, Wordsworth completely moves away from that realm. So he believes that, when you are writing about something that is closely associated with experience, when it is your own experience that you are writing about, the feelings that comes out of it, or the feelings that comes out of it when you're writing a poem, it is more regular, it is more simpler, it's more associated with reality. So that is a kind of language also that he wants to use. He does not want to use lofty language like the neoclassical writers like Dryden, Pope, or Swift. And another thing that he believes is that when you use the language that is generated through experience, your own experience, or when you use the language that is closely related to your own feelings, he says that, that is more philosophical. These are the words that he uses. He uses the word philosophical and permanent. So when you use such language, he feels that it is more philosophical, it is more permanent than the language that was used by the late neoclassical poets like Dryden or. So it is not necessary that, because your language is, as a poet, we often feel that, maybe you use more complicated language. So you think that maybe, that's more philosophical. But here, Wordsworth completely deconstructs that idea that, more complex language means you are a better poet. No, he doesn't say that. He said that, the simpler your language, the easier your language, the more philosophical it is. He says it's more philosophical because, according to him, according to Wordsworth, philosophy is something that is associated with human life, human emotions. So the more simpler language that you use and the more simpler emotions that you are talking about, it is more philosophical, it is more permanent because it is associated with your own life as such. And he also says that, when you're talking about your own emotions and feelings in poetry, you would have thought, I mean, deeply about it, because it is your own emotions that are being constructed in the poem that you write. It's not about somebody else, it's not about somebody else's emotions, you're talking about your own experiences. So he also believes that is there is a kind of those kind of poems have what you call as a depth. They're not superficial. They have what you call as an and even when we read it, when we read those kind of poems, we realize that they are not superficial. They kind of have a depth that talk about closely about human emotions and experiences. Now, Wordsworth then goes on to talk about how such kind of poems, such kind of writings help us become a better person. And he also believes that each and every poem that you write, or each and every poem that he has written in the lyrical ballads, is associated with human emotions as such. Each and every poem that he writes in the lyrical ballads, Wordsworth says, it is associated with one specific kind of emotion. So let it be happiness, let it be sadness, or let it be anger. So any kind of poetry that he writes is associated with one kind of emotion. And another very, very interesting aspect that Wordsworth talks about here is that when you're looking at the earlier poets before Wordsworth, before the age of Romanticism, all of them would talk about how when they write poetry, they have certain situations, there are certain action that is taking place, and out of those situations and incidents, you have these feelings coming out. Yeah, but Wordsworth says for him, feelings are predominant. Yeah, incidents, situations, action, all these comes later for Wordsworth. That is why, I mean, when you're talking about romanticism as such, you're talking about aesthetics, you're talking about spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions. Because here, the incident, more than the incidents, more than the situations, Wordsworth said the situations do not give rise to feelings for him. But for him, feelings are predominant. And it is from these feelings that situations and incidents arise. For example, I'll give you an example. Maybe you can later go back and read that poem. Uh, he, in his lyrical ballads, he has written a poem called as "The Reverie of Poor Susan." So, reverie in the sense, the dream of a young girl called as Susan. That is what he describes in the poem. Now, this young girl, Susan, she has grown up and she has lived in the countryside all her life. But when she grows up a little bit, because of her family situation, she moves to the city of London. And when she comes to the city of London, I mean, there are varied emotions that are being invoked in her mind. So once when she is in the city of London and she is going to work, she's a young girl and she's going to work. She looks up at the tree because she could use a thrush singing. Thrush is a bird, so she could see a bird singing, and when she listens to the bird, a kind of feeling is invoked in her mind, in her heart. So I mean, the poem starts when these kind of feelings are evoked in her mind when she hears the bird singing. So it is first the feeling that comes here, and then what happens later is described in the poem. So when she listens to the bird singing, suddenly, I mean, she goes back to the same kind of bird singing in her childhood, in her, in her countryside where she grew up in. So she listens to the bird singing, and suddenly, she goes back to the space where she grew up in. And even in the countryside where she grew up, she would listen to these birds singing, the thrushes singing, and that sort of gives us a contrast between what kind of a life you lead in the village and what kind of a life you lead in the city. So all these incidents come only later. Wordsworth first talks about the fact that this girl listens to the song of the thrush when she is going for work in London. So when she listens to the song, there is a kind of feeling that is evoked, and then she starts dreaming. She actually goes into a dream where she thinks about her life in the countryside and how it is quite different from the life in the city. So here there is a feeling or emotion of nostalgia that is being evoked first, and then you go to the incident of comparing and contrasting how different rural and urban life is. So here you realize that for Wordsworth as such, it is emotions, and Wordsworth is like any other romantic poet of that age. So like all the romantic poets of those times, for him, emotions, feelings, aesthetics, all these are important, and the more common things like logic, reason, incidents, situations, all these things. Or construction of reality, all these things comes only later. First is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions. That is the instant thing that comes to mind, our mind as well, when we talk about Wordsworth's poetry. uh, But he says, Wordsworth, when he talks about his own poetry and the kind of poem that he writes in the preface to the lyrical ballads, he also talks about how slowly things are changing. He talks about modern writers, modernity, and modern writers who are slowly moving away from the sense of, being associated with common ideas and thoughts, and they're more moving towards lofty ideas. Wordsworth feels that, when you move away from situations that is associated with your own life, when you move away from common life situations and experiences, when you move away from reality and move towards the realm of what you call as lofty thoughts, Wordsworth feels that people cannot relate themselves to the masses. Yeah. One example that Wordsworth gives is that, we read Shakespeare even now. Yeah? Even after centuries later, we read Shakespeare now. We even when you look at Twelfth Night or What You Will or As You Like It or Tempest or anything, any of the plays of Shakespeare, it is relevant even now because the incidents that Shakespeare uh, describes in his plays, it is something that we can relate to it even now. Those are incidents that are related to common life as such. So he talks about a girl falling in love with a woman, but the woman, I'm sorry, a girl falling in love with the man being in love with somebody else. There is a comedy of errors towards the end in one of his comedies. And then when you talk about the Tempest, he talks about Caliban, the sort of post-colonialism, somebody else coming and reclaiming your land and claiming it as yours. I mean, even when we look at the politics now, we have, different sort of politicians coming up and encroaching upon the lands of the common people. So we realize that, we read Shakespeare now, and Shakespeare is relevant even now because he chooses to talk about incidents which are closer to life, which are closer to reality. That's why, we read about Shakespeare even now after, I guess some 400, 500 years. We are reading about Shakespeare now only because of that reason. So he says, if you want to connect with the masses, if you want to connect with the common people, it is very, very necessary that you need to stick to what is closer to nature as such. And that is why he says, when he comes back to his lyrical ballads again, and that is why he says, as far as his lyrical ballads are concerned, he does not want to talk about some lofty ideas. He does not want to talk about some abstract. Abstract means, it's something that you cannot really see, but you can only feel. So he does not want to talk about abstract ideas. He wants to talk about things that you can really perceive, that you can really see with your own eyes. So now we come to the, real idea of what Wordsworth wants a poet to do. So this is, as I told you, I'm going back to the topic, Wordsworth as a poet of the common man. So in the preface to the lyrical ballads, he says, Wordsworth describes the poet and he says, a poet is a man speaking to men in the language of men. That is a very interesting, idea that he puts forth, and he puts it forth in a very, very simple language. For him, poet is not somebody who is very philosophical. For him, a poet is not somebody who writes in a lofty language. For Wordsworth, a poet is a man speaking to another man in the language of man as such. So that is why he says that language need not be elevated. The language that a poet uses needs to be closer to truth, needs to be closer to reality. And another interesting thing is that Wordsworth here quotes Aristotle, and Aristotle says that poetry is the most philosophic of all writing. So he quotes Aristotle there, and Aristotle says poetry is the most philosophic of all writing. So according to Wordsworth here, philosophy doesn't mean lofty ideas, as I told you earlier, but philosophy is something that is closely associated with nature. Nature can also mean human nature as well. Most of the times, for Wordsworth, being closely associated with nature might also mean, he puns on the word nature. So for him, nature might also be something that is closely associated with human nature as well. So this is one of the main reasons, yeah, because we consider Wordsworth to be the poet of the common man, because Wordsworth says, a poet is somebody who speaks to another poet in the language of common man in itself. This is one of the reasons why Wordsworth says that, there is no difference between prose and poetry. See, generally, if we look at poetry and prose as such, generally, if we look at poetry and prose as such, we usually talk about the fact that poetry follows a certain rhythm, certain meter, certain poetic diction. Poetic diction means that, using lofty language, using pompous language, or using too much of metaphors, alliteration, hyperboles, all these figures of speech that we use. That is what I mean. No, the linguistic, basically the linguistic devices, too much of linguistic devices that we use. That is what is called as the poetic diction. Usually, when we talk about the poetry as such, we say that verse is different from prose. We say poetry is different from prose because prose is written in common language, like how we speak, we write prose. Yeah, a novel or a drama or something like that is written, a novel especially, or a short story, we write that in the language similar to what in the language that we speak. That is why there is always this perception as the language of poetry is different from the language of prose. Whereas we say that in language of poetry, it's not necessary that you need to use complete sentences. The rhythm that you use is completely different. You use similes, you use hyperboles, you use a lot of metaphors. Yeah, you use rhyming patterns where one word rhymes with the other. Yeah, the first line rhymes with the second line rhymes with the fourth line. So these are the kind of ideas that we have when we talk about poetry as such. But Wordsworth says it is not needed that a poem should follow some kind of rhythmic pattern. The poem should use lofty ideas. For him, the language of poetry and the language of prose is one and the same. He says that it's not necessary that the way we write poetry should be completely different from the way we write prose. Prose can also be poetry as such. I'll give you, one example of how he writes in the. Just a minute. I'll give you an example of how he writes in one of his poems as such. The Reverie of Poor Susan that I told you about. See, in that poem, and the beginning of the poem, this is how Wordsworth writes. Wordsworth says, at the corner of Wood Street, when this is the Reverie of Poor Susan, written by Wordsworth. I'm just reading out to you the first paragraph to just make you understand, the way he writes. So he says, at the corner of Wood Street, when daylight appears, there is a thrush that sings loud. It has sung for 3 years. Poor Susan has passed by the spot and has heard in the silence of morning the song of the bird. Now look at the kind of lines that he uses. He says, poor Susan has passed by the spot and has heard. Now this reads like prose. This does not read like poetry as such. This is how we usually speak as well. And he says, in the silence of morning, the song of the bird could be heard. So when you're talking about the fact that in the silence of the morning, the song of the bird could be heard, all these are the common language that we use when we speak as such. So according to Wordsworth, there is no specific definition, difference between the language of prose and poetry. And that is one of the major reasons why he is not interested in using what you call as poetic diction. As I told you earlier, poetic diction is the usage of lofty ideas, is the usage of a lot of linguistic devices like metaphors, hyperboles, too much of complex linguistic devices that you use. So Wordsworth does not want to use all these poetic devices, and he wants to keep it just simple. Simple in the sense that, so even if you read the poetry to a child who is as young as 10 or 11 years old, the child should be able to understand what the poet has written about. That is the kind of poetry that Wordsworth wants to write. So, then he, towards the end of the preface to the lyrical ballads, what he talks about is that, so what is this process of poetic creation for him? I've already talked to you about it, and these lines are very, very familiar to us because this is an often quoted line. I myself quoted these lines a lot of times in this lecture. So, for what is the process of poetic creation for Wordsworth? See, for Wordsworth, poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings and emotions. And according to him, these powerful feelings and emotions, they take its origins from emotions recollected in tranquility. Yeah. So poetry is a spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, and it takes its origin from emotions recollected in tranquility. So what Wordsworth says is that uh, emotions or poetry is not an afterthought for him. It's not something that you think and write. Like I told you about the daffodils, you pass by something. Same thing with the young girl Susan. She just looks at the thrush and she writes. Maybe that is a scene that Wordsworth observed when he was in London at that point of time. So what he observes, what he thinks immediately is what he writes. It's not like Coleridge. Coleridge wakes up from his sleep and then he kind of reminiscences what he has seen in his dream. He recollects it, and that's what he writes in his poetry. For Wordsworth, it's not more about dreaming and imagination and all that. Wordsworth is about more spontaneous. What he sees is what he writes. So it's a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotion, feelings and emotion, and takes its origins from emotions recollected in tranquility. So you are calm, and in your calm space, you think about a certain specific kind of emotion, and from that, a new kind of poetry is born. Yeah. And then further, when such kind of situations and come up, and you kind of contemplate the various emotions that you have experienced in your life, new kind of poetry comes forth. So this is the poetic composition that Wordsworth talks about, and he says that when you create poetry in this manner, when you create poetry that is closer to nature, when you create poetry that is spontaneous, when you create poetry that is more associated with sensibility, feelings, emotions, he feels that the poet gets a sort of pleasure. It's not only the poet who gets a sort of pleasure; even the readers get a sense of pleasure when they get a sense of pleasure and happiness when they read it. So when you're, when you see the beauty of the countryside and you are uh, describing it, it is very, very. When a reader reads it, they are able to relate to it, and they are also very happy when they read such kind of a poem. So for him, more than the words, yeah, more than the words on the page. You would have, one of the earlier lectures, you would have listened to the fact that, new criticism talks about the words on the page, yeah, or close reading. But here you're talking about the fact that, Wordsworth says more than the words on the page, more than the words of the poem, the emotions that it creates are very, very important. Yeah. So the in-depth emotion that the poem creates, that is what gives us a sort of pleasure. And this kind of pleasure that comes out of emotions that is closely related to reality or real life, for Wordsworth conveys a sense of truth. Yeah. So for him, what is truth? So for him, truth is all about associating yourself with reality, associating your being closer to nature, associating yourself with the rural rather than the urban, being more spontaneous in your emotions. All these are things that makes or gives a kind of pleasure when you write a poem. And the same way, this kind of pleasure also conveys a sort of truth for Wordsworth, because you are trying to convey what is happening in reality. So when you're trying to convey something that is happening in reality, that cannot be false according to Wordsworth, because it's not something that is you are recreating. It's not something that is false. It's not something that comes out of your imagination. Because if you look at Coleridge and his poem on Kubla Khan, he recollects half of the things from his imagination once he wakes up from sleep. Half of the things that he writes in the poem are from his own imagination, which he does not dream about. So it is a mixture of fancy, imagination that Coleridge brings forth into his poetry. But for Wordsworth, even if you look at Wordsworth, another poem, The Prelude, it talks about whatever he has experienced in his growing up years. That is what he describes as, describes in his poems. So, because such a lot of, such a lot of work goes into creating a poem, Wordsworth says that as readers, we should not be quick to judge a poem and say that this poet is bad and this poet is good. He says in a minute we cannot. Just we read the poem once and we cannot understand whether the poet is good or bad. Even if we feel that maybe the poet has not written the poem in a proper manner, Wordsworth says that the poet has taken such a lot of effort in writing the poetry, so that if you slam the poet, it might affect the future career of the poet as well. So he says, when you are reading the work of the poet as a reader, it is very, very important that, even if you feel that, maybe this poem is not good or it's bad, it is very, very important that you do not give some sort of an immediate judgment. He says it's important that you go back to the poem, you review it, and you sort of give an opinion that is very fair. Because Wordsworth feels that, though it is a spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, there is it might be a little contradictory when I say this, but for him, there is a lot of effort that goes into writing a poem. And that's why he says that, as readers, we shouldn't slam the poem immediately as such. And so the way he finishes the preface to the lyrical ballads is that, he says, he says he does not want to go against anybody, or he says he does not want to go against the way poetry is written, and he also does not want to create any kind of revolution as such through his collection of poems in lyrical ballads. But what he says is that he feels he needs to create a new kind of poetry, a new genre of poetry, a genre where uh, the poet talks to common man in the language of man himself, and he feels that what he had in mind he has achieved through the through the collection of lyrical ballads, and he also wants the readers to gauge his collection of poetry and give their opinion as to whether he has achieved in his collection of poetry whatever he has mentioned in his preface. Now I'll just come back to the title. So why do you talk about Wordsworth as being the poet of the common man? Because for Wordsworth, his philosophy of poetry is something that is associated with human beings as such, with nature, with sensibility, with emotions, and he also believes in being associated with rustic life, the life of the peasants, the rural countryside. And he also talks about the fact that it is not necessary to use lofty language. As poets, we need to talk to the readers in their language so that they can easily understand it. So that is why with reference to these specific collections called as a preface to the lyrical ballads, we say that Wordsworth is the poet of the common man. So this is what with this, I would like to end my lecture. So in case you have any questions, you can ask.
Thank you so much, Kavitha. It was indeed an excellent lecture. You have started your lecture with a detailed depiction of the historical backdrop of romantic movement. Then you talked about the emotion, sensibility, and how it moves about logic, reason, conventions. You have lucidly explained the essential features of the romantic movement and also mentioned various precursor romantic movements like Blake. And you have also talked about the necessary background and introduced all the great romantic poets like Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, Byron. And you have also pointed out how those poets move away from the conventions. And you have also mentioned the general features of Wordsworth poetry in general and previous to lyrical ballad in particular. Parallelly, you have also pointed out how Wordsworth justifies his ideas and concepts in the preface to the lyrical ballad. And most importantly, you have justified your topic towards the end, and you have justified how Wordsworth can be called as a poet of a common people. Thank you so much for your simple explanation of a complex topic. I am quite sure the students will be extremely benefited from your talk. Thank you so much, Kavitha. Now, with your permission, I can see there are many questions lined up for you. So, with your permission,
Okay.
let us go to the question answer session. Okay, the questions will be on your screen.
Okay. Okay. Um, okay. Will the others also be able to see the questions?
Yes, everyone
Okay.
will.
Will they also be able to see the questions, or should I tell what the question is? They can see
No,
the
no, no,
questions.
everyone can see the question.
Okay, so one of them has asked, is Preface to Lyrical Ballads a revolutionary manifesto? Now, if you're talking about the point of time that Wordsworth was writing it, though he says it's not revolutionary towards the end of his lyrical ballads, it is in fact, a revolutionary manifesto in the sense that he moves away from all the complex and lofty ideas that his predecessors have talked about, and uses simple language to explain the kind of poetry or poem that he writes. So if you look at it that way, the preface to lyrical ballads is definitely a revolutionary manifesto, because you're completely moving away from the the idea of what a poem is. Yeah. So earlier people looked at poetry as something that is more philosophical, something that is more ideological. But when you are looking at Wordsworth here, for him philosophy is something that is closely associated with human nature and emotions. So that itself, he creates a revolutionary ideas. Otherwise, when we talk about philosophy, for us philosophy is lofty ideas that normal human being cannot understand. Only a well learned person can understand what philosophy is all about, philosophical ideas is all about. But for Wordsworth, philosophy is something that is simple. Philosophy is something that is associated with human life and emotions. So in every way, I personally believe, this is my personal opinion, I personally believe that Professor Lyrical Ballads is in fact a revolutionary manifesto from which the later poets like Keats, Shelley, and all carried on from. He can be called as a pioneer. Okay. This question is that, can Wordsworth aesthetic ideas be regarded as derogatory? What resulted in judgments such as common, ordinary, everyday, and the humble? It is now that we have, when we talk about ordinary or the word ordinary, or when you talk about the word common, or when you talk about humble, everyday, all these things, I think it is we who look at it with a negative connotation. Right? These are in fact words that should be exalted and kept at the top. I think that, as readers, or maybe writers after Wordsworth who have come forth, after the words of age of romanticism, you have industrialization, you have the Victor, and so a lot of things coming up. So maybe, later, when the later poets started writing, or the readers started reading it from a completely different perspective, I think it is we who associated all these words like common, ordinary, everyday, humble with something that is derogatory. I personally believe that, as a poet who talks about common emotions, it's not common at all. You're talking about something that is part of your everyday life, and that is what should be concentrated more on. You're talking about something that is ordinary rather than go talk about the extraordinary. Right? If you look at, I think one of the lectures that you would have gone through would have been Eliot's tradition and the individual talent. So Eliot says that, if you are going to try to look at the individual aspect, or the aspect of any poet where he is unique, it's not possible. Nobody can be extraordinary. No one can be unique. If you are writing something, you are always. That's why Eliot also says tradition and individual talent. You are of course associated with tradition. You are of course influenced by those who have come before you and have written before you. So nothing that you write can be unique, nothing that you write can be extraordinary. What you write is a continuation of what your predecessors have written. So in fact, humble, when you're talking about somebody being humble, that is a very, very positive quality that you were talking about. But later, when you're talking about humble, it started being associated with those who belong to the lower sections of the society. Yeah, you say that, he comes from a humble background. Humble can also have a different connotation as being, someone who has the humility, someone who is simple, rather than, associating it with somebody who comes from a lower economic strata of the society. So I think it's we who give it a derogatory term, but for Wordsworth, these were the terms that were extraordinary as such. So these are my own perceptions that I'm giving. Okay. Do you think Wordsworth's vivid and um yeah, that's very true. See, they're talking about, Wordsworth's sympathetic portrayal of his characters led his humanitarianism and emotional impetus, which intensifies the political thrust of his points. See, I told you about how Wordsworth started writing his preface to the lyrical ballads during the beginning of the French Revolution. Now, the French Revolution in itself was to overthrow monarchy, but I also told you about how the French Revolution in itself resulted in Napoleon being the dictator, and again you have the authority in the hands of the single person. So, of course, if you look at Wordsworth's poems and his preface to the lyrical ballads, there are a lot of undercurrents which no denote to his political views, because even in the preface to the lyrical ballads, Wordsworth talks about freedom. And Wordsworth talks about the importance of public opinion. Wordsworth talks about how it's necessary that we need to have individual freedom, because if you look at a person like Rousseau, who was one of the predecessors of Wordsworth. Rousseau says man is born free, but everywhere he is in chains. So that is the kind of the perspective that that we are born free, but everywhere we are in chains. We are everywhere in chains because of the societal rules and regulations, because of the political party who is ruling us, because of the social conventions, traditions. So subtly, Wordsworth is trying to give an idea of his politics, where he says that you need to move away from what the political parties or the all-powerful single authority says. You need to have a public opinion. You need to express. You need to have your own freedom. You shouldn't be, chained by the fetters of what you call as the social rules and regulations. That is what Romanticism in itself is all about. It is all about breaking the traditions and the conventions. So there is a political thrust in his poems. Okay, so see, when Wordsworth is talking about the modern writers, see, Wordsworth feels that they use kind of lofty ideas. Their ideas are over the top. The kind of language that they use seem to be very complicated. Because the modern writers wanted to create an image. Yeah, they wanted to create an image that the poet is somebody who is superior. The poet is somebody who is elevated in nature. The poet is somebody who cannot be reached. It's someone who cannot be reached by the common man. He's completely different from the common man. So that is what many of the modern writers try to portray. But for Wordsworth, it is not so. For him, the poet is not someone who who should be on a pedestal. The poet who is not someone who is of an elevated nature. For him, the poet is also a common human being like any other man around you. And that is where he talks about the language as well. If you look at the language of the modern writers, they use too much of meter, they use too much of rhythm, poetic diction, and too much of the rhetorical devices. So for them, for the modern writers, the language should be complex, because they felt that if somebody reads my poem and immediately understand it, where is my position in the society? How will people think of me as a poet? That's a common perception that we have even now when we write poetry, right? If you write it in the language of prose, people sometimes might tell you that it reads like common language. Where is poetry here? So that is where Wordsworth describes the modern writers' language, that they use too much of poetic diction, which Wordsworth completely shied away from. Because see, what Wordsworth says is that as far as poetry is concerned, he says it is not poetic diction which gives you the value of poetry, but it's the subject and the kind of emotions and the language that you use in a poem that gives its value. So that is why he completely moves away from what many of the modern writers talks about in terms of meter, rhythm, or poetic diction. Okay, what according to Wordsworth, the truth? What according to Wordsworth, truth trust poetry give? How is the truth communicated? Now, see, for Wordsworth, truth is anything that is associated with reality. Yeah, truth is anything that is associated with reality. Truth is anything that is associated with common incidents, situations, life around you. And Wordsworth says that when you read a poem or when you write a poem, that the pleasure that you derive out of it is because you write about something that is real and that is something that is closer to life. So for him, truth is the idea that you write about something that is closer to reality, you write about something that is closer to life, and that is the kind of truth that poetry gives. For example, I don't remember the name of the poem exactly. There is one poem where Wordsworth talks about the poem of Lucy Gray. He talks about a young girl who lives in the forest, and she grows up in the forest as such. And Wordsworth talks about how she learns a lot of qualities from nature. Wordsworth says that there is a huge storm in the forest in which the girl lives, and there are some trees which fall down, but there are some trees which do not fall when there is a storm. Yeah. So when the young girl sees that, there are some trees which fall trees who are able to withstand the storm, withstand the climate, withstand the rage. Wordsworth says she learns the quality of resilience from that particular tree. So this is a kind of truth that poetry gives for Wordsworth. What you can associate with real life. So you're looking at nature, and same thing, you talk about a spider spinning a web. The first time that the spider spins a web, it is not successful. It keeps on doing it again and again and again until it is successful. So that is a kind of truth that that is associated with life, associated with the quality of a human being as such, that Wordsworth is talking about. And how is the truth communicated? As I told you earlier, the truth is communicated in a way that the common man can understand. He uses the language of the common man to convey his ideas. As I told you here, he says a young girl called as Lucy Gray understands the power of resilience from the fact that the tree does not fall down when there is a storm. So she understands that in her life, whatever problem comes, she might be able to withhold it, withstand it, and come out successful. So that is conveyed to the readers in a very, very precise and simple manner in which we can understand, and how we can we can associate that poem itself. The quality of resilience is something that each one of them can associate it with our lives as well. So I think that is how he communicates this idea. Okay, now one of them have asked about how Wordsworth emotions recollected in tranquility with Eliot's escape from personality. Now, when you look at Eliot in his tradition and individual talent, he talks about, a depersonalization or impersonality. According to Eliot, a poet is somebody who does not involve himself in the process of poetic creations at all. In the sense that, for Eliot, the emotions and experiences that he has had in his life is completely different from the kind of emotions that he produces in his poems. Yeah, so that is where for Eliot, a poet just acts as a catalyst. So a catalyst is something that speeds up the chemical reaction, but the catalyst in itself does not undergo any change. So for Eliot, the poet is like a catalyst. He talks about the concept of impersonality or depersonalization, where the poet in himself is not involved in the process of poetic creation at all. This is where you talk about alienation, right? The poet is alienated from the poem. The poem is different. The poet is different. But what you are talking about here is, I believe Wordsworth is talking about some kind of a different idea, where he talks about the sense of calmness, but Wordsworth never says that, Eliot talks about escape from personality or depersonalization, but Wordsworth never says you need to escape from your personality as such. He just says that, in your sort of tranquility or calmness, you recollect emotions and you create poetry out of it. So it is your own emotions, it's your own experiences. You are not escaping from your personality, like how Eliot says poetry, is an escape from emotions. Eliot uses the words poetry is the turning loose of your emotions. You are completely moving away from emotions, and that is not what Wordsworth says.
Kavitha ma'am, one of my colleagues, Tanu, he has posed a question, but it is in a double part. So let me put the questions. It's a continuous question.
I think I can see the question.
Yes. Can you see the question?
Yeah, I can see the question.
Uh, so it has another part. After reading the first part, I will put the second one.
Okay, what is the other part? I can see only one. Okay. Now, when he's talking about poetic diction as such, you've asked about the fact that, he says meter is not essential to poetry, but he has himself used meter in poetry. That serves to all poets. Whenever they're talking about something, they do make contradictory statements. Even in, Eliot as well, when he says it's an escape from personality, you also realize that Eliot does write about what he has experienced in his personal life, in his poems as well. So when we talk about poets and their writings as such, it's not, they do not exactly write what they profess. But one thing about Wordsworth and his poetic addiction is that, see, Wordsworth, if you look at the preface to the lyrical ballads and in the 1802 area of the preface, he writes a completely different, piece on poetic diction as such. Now, there, what he says is that he's completely against the use of poetic diction. But what he says is that, you can use meter and rhythm. That's what he says. He does not say that, he does not say refrain from using meter and rhythm. He just says do not use poetic diction. Poetic diction means too much of complex language using hyperboles, metaphors. That is what he says, we should refrain from using. Though he does not say that, you need to use meter and rhythm always. He's not, he is comfortable with using the language of prose. In his preface, he does talk about the fact that, you can use meter and rhythm, and to a certain extent, when meter and rhythm essentially means that, there you need to stress your stressed and unstressed syllables. So in language, when we speak, also we stress at certain points of time, we use a certain kind of a tone. So meter and rhythm does become an essential part of poetry. So if you look at the other part that Wordsworth writes, he says you can use meter and rhythm. And he also talks about the fact that, if you use meter and rhythm in the proper manner, it can also give you a sense of pleasure. So that's what he says. So though he says meter and rhythm is not necessary, he says you can use it. But he's completely against the usage of poetic diction. So this is what I could understand from, Wordsworth. So that is why, he does use meter and rhythm when he talks about his own poems as well.
Thank you so much, Kavitha. I hope Atanu has got his answer. And it was an excellent question, and you have explained all the questions in a very lucid manner. And I'm very sure all the all the person who are watching this are get hugely benefited out of your talk. Now, let me thank you again for taking the invitation and for joining us for your erudite talk. Thank you.
So
And
thank you so much.
yeah.
Okay, so this is the first time I'm giving a talk outside of my college as well. So this is also the first experience for me. So I was a little nervous in the beginning. So I'm happy that it has come out well. So I'm happy.
It went very well, and the comments of which I am receiving, it takes positive side of your talk. So it went. So before concluding the session, let me mention tomorrow's speaker. Tomorrow's speaker will be Dr. Lisa Sinha, and she will be talking on the topic "Subjective Lamb Meets His Past: A Select Study of Charles Lamb's Essays." So join us again tomorrow at 11:30 for the session. Thank you so much. Stay safe.